सही है. Part B, blue कर लेते हैं. Apart from the employment composition and structure, तो इन दो चीजों को रेफर नहीं करना है. Discuss what changes are likely to occur in a developing country if it progresses towards developed status. Consider whether these changes are always beneficial. Okay, so I would say that this question can be broken down into two things that will be happening, and most probably simultaneously, that you identify a change. So that's more of the identify and explain the change, and then you discuss whether that is beneficial, and then you conclude whether these overall the more popular changes, the more common changes, whether they generally are beneficial or not.
What we can do is like पहले अपने लिए at least थोड़ा सा list कर लेते हैं सारे, और फिर आराम से we can write the answer ना, structuring कर सकते हैं.
Okay. Yeah, इधर भी गंदगी की हुई है. So we can just to like help us plan out a bit. It's always nice to make a plan. So just generally like क्या changes आते हैं when discuss what changes are likely to occur in a developing country if it progresses towards developed status. So again, I would say link it back to the definition that we put forward in part A about just how how economic development happens. So kind of link all those factors of economic development. And I would say the first major factor of any index that measures economic development is economic growth. So basically GDP. Or a better way to put it is real GDP per capita, but I think you get what I mean. So like growth would be one.
Then living standards, HDI वगैरह.
Okay, so stuff relevant to education. सही है. So also stuff relevant to health. So so poverty,
employment हो गया.
Employment आपके maybe you could even so poverty में if you go at absolute poverty, so yes, you could even look at a bit at relative poverty and talk about income inequality maybe.
Income.
So income distribution. Health poverty.
You can also go at look at the other side as well. Environmental degradation भी हो सकती है if you move towards there.
मतलब मैंने income distribution बोला, तुमने कुछ से link करके environmental degradation बोल दिया.
नहीं, मैंने अलग सोच के बोला. मैंने employment is important सही है ना, employment भी मैंने बोला, तो मैंने नहीं लिखा.
Environmental degradation, if I remember correctly, so I believe the ISEU, the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare in particular, takes this into account. So when gauging, how but when measuring the standard of living, and the higher the standard of living, the more developed you are. So yes, environmental degradation is important. There are a few things. I mean, like because like a lot of these you could just expand on further. I don't think you need. I mean, can you think of any other important one? I think it pretty much covered a lot.
I think बाकी सबको लिखते you realize कि हाँ ये भी हो सकता है.
Yeah, and with 13 marks, so like, we won't even have that much amount of time. Yeah. So I don't think we need any sort of introduction. I think we can just jump right in.
Also because we've already done that
in part A basically. So yeah, so you pick number 1, which is so economic growth, which you can measure it in terms of whatever GDP, NNY, whatever, like any ideas basically how output, employment, stuff like that. So you explain what.
Starting with we are assuming ना कि हमने एक आध टाइम तो कुछ लिखी होगी कि हाँ developing से develop में जाएंगे तो ये कुछ ना कुछ चीजें.
I mean, yeah, like you can be like, okay, when a country goes from developing to develop,
नहीं है कोई बंदा start कर दे GDP is this और ये और वो like directly.
I mean, if I were writing the answer, I would say that okay, when a country goes from developing to developed, there are a few changes that undergo. Some of that occur. Some of the more important ones would be, and what I would do if I'm a little confident with myself, I would just in those first lines mention a few of these changes, like kind of like what people do in debates at times as signposting. And the reason why I would do that is because the examiners just skim through your answer. So then they're like, okay, the guy said he's going to talk about 4 changes. He's going to write about 4 changes. So he must have written about those 4 changes. And then you have a paragraph about every change and that discusses the pros and cons of it. So just from an examination perspective. But yeah, so like you have a trashy 1 2 line intro, and then you get to GDP growth basically. So economic growth kya hai? You can talk about how it's basically the increase in real GDP per head, which leads to, if you talk about the pros here, so the employment,
national income.
Yeah, I mean, like economic growth is वैसे the increase in national income, like GDP बोला तो एक ही चीज, but yeah, okay, employment, well, output again, it's just the same as GDP, but like, so incomes, national income, like, here we've mentioned national income, but how that translates into higher wage incomes for like households as well, assuming slightly decent distribution. However, then you talk about the cons, and with regards to the cons of this, so there could be inflationary pressures, which obviously make life a little tough for your consumer base and lead to a lot of issues that you can elaborate on. Competitiveness nahi bachti, costs pe badh jate hain, all of those issues of inflation. Don't go too deep because you have to cover a lot, but like just drop a lot of things, like हाँ ये भी है, ये भी है. Inflationary pressures हो आते हैं. A lot of the time growth, well, it could either have happened because of a current account deficit, because you were importing a lot of capital, or even if that is not true, even if that was not the case, growth and high levels of incomes and all does lead to a current account deficit because you become more consumeristic, more import related. So like current account क्या है, इससे बेहतर है मैं balance of trade deficit लिख देता हूँ. So stuff like that, no need to go into too much detail. Then you have stuff around the lines of education. I mean, and I just picked education as a theme. You just talk about a few metrics here. So like the HDI, for example, it looks at the literacy rate. It also looks at the average years of schooling. And now after 2010, once they've updated it, it also looks at the expected years of schooling and then compares the average to that. For example, in Pakistan, the expected year is maybe one more than in Canada. So like then, and it links things like that. So you could write that, like anything that comes under education, so literacy rate, years of schooling, even I think trainings, even availability of vocational training, the education के नीचे आ जाती है. What do you say? Whoops. Where vocational training basically, training for a particular craft. So like, vocational training could come under this. And you talk about how all of this type of stuff is supposed to go up, because this is an important metric of the standard of living, and that needs to go up for you to grow. With regards to this, well, pros to
I just chip in something here. Development is different than growth, and I'll just mention it somewhere around these lines. Yeah, development कुछ और होती है, growth से ज़्यादा होती है, and उसके अंदर we can talk about education and health and बाकी सब कुछ.
Okay. So, in fact, just to build on that, what I would do, instead of giving out a trashy one-line opening, maybe I'd start off with that. Okay. So the average person might use growth and development synonymously, However, economists have to make that क्या कहते हैं, have to take care of that dichotomy or that difference basically. And then you explain how you don't need to explain what development is because you did that in party, I believe, but you explain how growth is a factor, that is an important factor that affects development. However, development is not limited to growth. That's the idea. And then you go to growth, then you go to stuff like education. इससे pros क्या होते हैं? So सबसे बड़ा pro is your labor productivity, and this is not just limited to trainings, like labor productivity, obviously productivity and employability, because you want a LUMS graduate, you don't want like ID के सब. क्या यूनी की बात नहीं करते यार, sad
Oxford
scene.
guy. Want an Oxford guy.
But you get a LUMS graduate though, फायदा नहीं है. So yeah, so that's an important pro. I don't know what would be the cons of padhai.
Yeah, I don't think we should divide it into pros and cons. You just say कि ये भी होता है लेकिन साथ में ये भी हो सकता है. अगर con होता है तो वरना con अब we can't say health में कोई con हो सकता है.
Yeah. So like, don't use brute force, because if you read the question again, discuss what changes are likely to occur and and whether these changes are always beneficial. So every single change doesn't have to have a negative and a positive. Like some will have both. Some will be mainly positive, some will be mainly negative, and we're going to talk about them individually now, but we'll talk about the net change overall. So like education will be a very small factor. So it's very important, but like there's not much to write about it. So healthcare, and again you take a look at some of the indices we used. So like not indices, but like the metrics we use. So like stuff like birth rate, but maybe not birth rate, but like life expectancy, death rate, infant mortality, access to clean water with regards to sanitation, like number, this is a nice metric, number of doctors
Per patient.
yeah, so you can either take per thousand or whatever, like the idea is ratio kya hai doctors ka, so stuff like that, all of that is supposed to go up, all of that is supposed to improve, especially with increases in social spending, which is basically government spending on provision of healthcare, subsidizing private healthcare, providing public sector hospitals.
And generally more number of doctors is well education अपना वैसे दी हुई है तो.
Yeah, so doctors per person or per 1,000 should go up. Right. Then you talk about poverty, and perhaps so would make sense to talk about here is first you can talk about poverty in three ways, right? So like poverty. Yeah. So you first talk about absolute. And Sherry, how would we define absolute poverty?
Yeah, absolute poverty is like mean an income. I think it's $1.2. I think $1 per day, US dollars. So उसके नीचे if anyone earns, so that he is absolutely poor in terms of
yeah. So basically anyone below that particular poverty line. So like मैंने चलो 1.2 मैंने ऐसे ही सुना था between $1 to $2. I don't remember what it was, but per day. So like, and the idea here is you're ensuring that they can at least meet their bare minimum needs. सही है, तो like वो हमने कर दिया है. Relative poverty जो है, that is how much the household falls below the nation's median or the nation's average, ऐसा कुछ था.
इसमें I would also include one thing. I would talk about the MPI as well, the multidimensional poverty index.
I was getting to that.
It's not just income; it's more about other things as well.
So you talk about the multidimensional poverty index, hence multidimensional poverty. Um, and the idea here is that wahi, as Shai said, it's not just about income. It's about other things. We've covered a few. So health, education we've covered, but you can talk about other things like I think leisure isme aata tha, nahi aata tha. But the idea is that there's a lot to talk about. So MPI, I think I believe not the MPI. So there was something H. So there's also your HPI. The so that's the basically to there to complement your HDI. So that's the human poverty index. But that is different for developing countries and for developed countries. For developed countries, it looks more like things like I don't know social exclusion. When developing, it'll look like like access to clean water, more of that type of stuff. So based on those values, that stuff could also change. But like yeah, uh, you talk about three things about poverty. You don't have to explain too much because we've already covered a lot of things of the MPI in previous points. Relatives, I think you could link to your fourth, which is basically distribution of income, equality or inequality rather. You could draw the Kuznets curve here, or I don't know what you call it here. Do you still call it the Kuznets curve?
यार क्योंकि the reason we हम लोग ने environment की बात की है तो we use that there ना. This is I think the Lorenz curve
Um,
जिसमें the Gini
the
coefficient you do not calculate इस तरह ना, you the straight
you
line
don't
के
you
वो जो
don't you, well yeah, you don't calculate it is tarah, but you can show it here. The okay,
yeah
so
you
so the
can,
Lorentz.
but by axis पे I think it's not Gini coefficient, it's more income inequality. Yeah, and नीचे it's income.
You can draw the Gini coefficient on the y-axis. The only reason the only reason I'm a little confused between whether or not to draw the Lorentz curve or the Gini coefficient, because the Gini coefficient links, sorry, or the Kuznets curve, because the Kuznets curve links inequality to like growth, so which kind of links to development. कि चलो, a bit of growth, which is a factor of development, might not help. However, after a certain point, then you start to become more conscious of stuff like that.
Cousins का यार I was thinking to use it towards the end kind of thing, क्योंकि like we talk about environment वगैरह ना, तो उसमें we can end कि हाँ जरूरी नहीं है कि बुरा हो, बाद में जाके सही भी हो सकता है. इसमें भी ना inequality में भी it
Okay,
might
we
लगे
can
बुरा लेकिन
we can draw the Lorentz curve. Lorentz curve, which is an interesting curve. So you have इधर क्या था, percentage of income,
I guess
and this was basically percentage of recipients, yeah, percentage of population,
households वगैरह.
yeah, basically. The idea is to see कितना पैसा कितने लोगों के पास है. Like does your if your population has like if 80% of the wealth of the population is with 20% of people, then it's inequality काफी है. This comes your 45-degree line representing perfect equality, and your Lorentz curve is here. The more it deviates from the line, the more in inequality is there. Either to 100%. The reason why it goes back to the line is because either 100% income is shared by 100% of the population, so either to line पे वापस जाएगा. And if you want to calculate the Gini coefficient, I wouldn't go into this much detail for the question, but just because it's a nice curve that not that I think, well, a lot of people have asked me about this, so like I think a lot of people do struggle with this. So if we just recap how to calculate the Gini coefficient. So it's Gini coefficient, and the Gini coefficient is basically a coefficient that ranges from 0 to 1, where 1 is perfect inequality and 0 is perfect equality. So the lower the Gini coefficient, the more equal or fair your population, your economy is. To calculate it, you have the shaded area upon area of triangle ABC. So like this. care, but you wouldn't go into that much detail for the context of this question. हमने कितनी सही है. You could then draw the then talk about environmental degradation. And this is interesting. So normally, well, not maybe not normally, but in some cases, environment, your consciousness of the environment is seen as a factor of development, because obviously you want to ensure that you have like stuff like lower levels of smog, of pollution. Once you have that, then you move towards development. So that's the thing you're going to start off with, that like degradation जब कम होती है, so that what helps you develop, because standard of living improves. uh, de- However, then you could talk about how in reality a very important factor of development is क्या कहते हैं, your growth. And then you
Okay,
could
growth.
draw, yeah, and then you could draw the Kuznets curve, the environmental Kuznets curve, which puts environmental degradation on the y-axis, and real GDP, let's say, or growth, whatever you want to put, on the x-axis, go something like this. So idea is that at lower levels of GDP, like here, since you're basically like more on subsistence methods, you're not really damaging the environment that much. As you start to grow from then on, because then you go towards more of the manufacturing industry, a little more industrialization, then you really damage the environment. But after a certain point, उधर अकड़ ठिकाने आ जाती है, and then you start to be conscious and put legislation and measures in place which reduces
Is
degradation.
a question like, should we mention this अभी कि कब consciousness आ जाती है and कब you start moving towards less degradation, या फिर हम बाद में बताएं इसको कि conclusion के टाइम पे कि हाँ हमेशा बुरा हो नहीं सकता, because इस एक certain point के बाद they be concerned about environment as well and they start working towards it. तो फिर
Okay, so what else do you want to tell after this? I think we're at our end.
but like उसमें फिर we can talk about everything collectively ना साथ में.
Yeah.
I'm just asking कि should we अलग से बता दें इसको या फिर एक साथ ही collectively बता दें.
So I would say, now a nice way to end. Okay, so you just talk about environmental degradation the way we did a little generally, about how you need to reduce it in order to develop. That's something that's a change you'd see as you move towards
हाँ.
developing. Um, and then you'd be like, however, it might not be that hunky dory. And then you could even draw the Kuznets curve for environmental degradation and the Kuznets curve for income inequality side by side, and then you could conclude with the conclusion that it really depends to the extent of your development, or to the because again, development and growth is farak hai, but a very important factor of development is growth. So they are proportional at the very least. So your conclusion is like, could be more along the lines, depends on what. Well, obviously you could write a lot, depends on what type, all of that type of stuff, but depends on the extent of development. And a very nice example to give is of China, right? So it grew a lot at the cost of, um, let's say, poor labor standards, at the cost of environmental degradation. But now, because it grew so much, now it's perhaps, well, it's debatable where it's positioned on its Kuznets curve, but people would say that either boy either pawns guy. Some people would be like, "Nahin, it's stopping, it's slowing down degradation." But whatever the idea is now, it's not polluting at such a rate. It's going towards things like solar energy and so on and so forth. So after a certain point, after you develop to a certain degree, the changes that uh, that were brought about were maybe like initially, or at lower levels of development, maybe a little क्या कहते हैं, harmful. But overall, the net change as you complete your entire journey that net change would definitely be beneficial. I think that's the idea. Um, should we check the marking scheme?
हाँ,
Uh, changes
control है ये
in
तो बहुत.
social factors. Okay, we didn't do too much of that. चलो health कर लिया, education, housing कर सकते थे, incomes कर लिया, sanitation, environmental change, distribution of income. So what we could have talked about social factors. How would we link social factors into this? Um, so maybe there's more social inclusion, like because a greater amount of your population is like educated. Um,
Also,
you
in a more developed country, you are more likely to choose your leaders and political involvement as well.
Oh yeah,
In
yeah.
a more
And I think that's a little thing. The political side of things we left out a bit, which is bad on our bit. So stuff like rule of law, all of that type of stuff, political stability, those are also changes that come about as you move from developing to developed. Democracy is one of them. Okay, so we could have added that. Resource use, again, this kind of links to I believe what we were talking about. Uh, you go in a more sustainable path now. Is that what they're trying to link?
maybe that, or maybe they can talk about कि हाँ इनके पास resources हैं developing nations में, but they're not utilizing them properly. अब as we develop, we use our resources well, we produce a higher output, like GDP बढ़ती है.
Yeah, okay, so that okay, probably that's more likely. We could resource utilization, housing. I mean, I don't know. गरीबों के लिए घर बना दो.
नहीं, they can maybe like shanty town से बेहतर buildings में रह रहे होगे
हाँ,
apartments, but मतलब
yeah.
that's not that important मेरे हिसाब से इस question
I, I,
है,
I
लेकिन
I mean, the marketing team just drops a lot of things. They don't expect you to write every single one of them. We still discuss them just to have clarity. But yeah, housing in particular, when you link it to the rural-urban divide that is very prevalent in developing countries because of the because maybe of the urban bias that the governments may have because of, let's say, asymmetric growth that urban areas over rural areas have like undergone. Uh, there are, I believe 20 to 30% of squatter settlements हो जाती है, के slums, so on, when people migrate towards the urban area, so overcrowding, uh, a lot of squatter settlements. So with regards to that, when you build it up like that, maybe then housing makes a lot more sense, seems a lot more useful. And again, housing then helps you eradicate not absolute, maybe not even relative, but multidimensional poverty. So which is something that we talked about. So this question requires discussion of changes that might occur as a country develops. You have examples. This was another example where many candidates did not reach the whole of the question. Their answers remained as descriptive accounts of the changes and did not consider whether such changes were beneficial. And that is problematic because if you look at the marking scheme, max 7 without conclusion on whether beneficial. So 7 on 13, my maximum of 7 on 13 is not too good. But yeah, that was it for this question. ज़्यादा general knowledge का लग रहा था rather than an economics question. But definitely in part B, there are a lot of ways you can link economic diagrams and theories to it. So wherever possible, do so, because you don't want to write a question that just on the knowledge that you learned on, let's say, O level geography, because उसमें marks accordingly ही मिलेंगे.